Theater. Chapter 7. Theater. The dramatic instinct spurs us to make sense out of the life that we live by imitating it, to project ourselves into make-believe, to willingly suspend disbelief. The theatrical conventions are the conditions that the theater-going audience agrees to accept as real. These theatrical conventions have changed through history and take different forms in different cultures, and accepting them is part of the pleasure of going to plays. This chapter begins with tragedy, contrasting classical theater with Elizabethan theater. Classical theater conventions include use of masks, an all-male cast, the messenger, and the chorus that provides background information and made moral comments on the play's action. The Greek and Roman classical theater conventions for dramatizing violence differed. Violence in Greek plays occurred off stage, whereas violence in Roman plays happened on stage. Conventions of Elizabethan theater included poetry and wordplay, violent action, and the use of subplots. Classical tragedy involves one central character, or protagonist. This hero has a tragic flaw that leads to his downfall. Sophocles' masterpiece, Oedipus the King, features a model tragic hero in Oedipus. In Antigone, the tragic hero is Creon, whose arrogance causes the death of his son. But Oedipus and Creon realize that they are responsible for their own downfalls in classic recognition scenes. Aristotle's famous analysis of tragedy in his Poetics examines what moves people about tragic drama and why. He divided the elements of tragedy into plot, character, thought, poetry, spectacle, and song. Aristotle's Poetics also describes the concept of catharsis, or the calm we feel after strong emotion, and of hubris, or arrogance, as they both relate to tragedy. Euripides' Medea appeals to modern audiences. It lacks the moral completeness of Oedipus or Antigone, in that Medea does not have a recognition scene in which she takes responsibility for her horrible actions. Major Shakespearean dramatic conventions are the soliloquy, in which the actor who is alone on stage speaks his or her thoughts aloud, and the aside, a remark that the audience hears, but the other actors are understood not to hear. Shakespeare wrote in verse called iambic pentameter, a line of 5 poetic units with a strong repetitive rhythm. Neoclassical tragedy of the latter half of the 17th century, like other arts of that period, saw a return to classical order and balance. Racine's Phaedra was elevated and elegant in tone and contrast to its passionate subject matter. It brought to theater the element of the inner life. In the 19th century, Victorian era, verisimilitude, or the effort to realistically imitate the appearance of the real world, was paramount in drama. Unlike Elizabethan times, actors never directly addressed the audience, because doing so would break the illusion of reality. Heinrich Ibsen revolutionized the theater of verisimilitude by addressing controversial social issues in, for example, the 1879 play A Doll's House, which exposes the superficiality of Victorian marriage. Next, the chapter turns to modern genres and conventions. The early 20th century saw the emergence of the expressionist genre, in which stage sets were no longer realistic but often were designed to convey a metaphor for society, such as a zoo or a prison. Playwrights of expressionism include Elmer Rice and his play The Adding Machine. A modern convention mentioned here is the flashback. Another is having 2 or 3 actors playing all the parts. Modern tragedy differs from Greek, Elizabethan, and neoclassical tragedy in that the focus is no longer on fatal mistakes made by the protagonists of high stature. Instead, the tragic protagonist is an ordinary person with an ordinary occupation. A good example from the Take a Closer Look feature in your chapter is Willie Loman, the main character in Death of a Salesman by Arthur Miller. Arthur Miller chose lowly heroes, but he elevated them to the moral stature of classical heroes. The chapter contrasts melodrama, in which the hero or heroine is always innocent and the bad guys are always evil, with true tragedy, the contrast here, which is far more morally complex. A convention of melodrama is the deus ex machina, meaning God from the machine, in which a convenient plot device saves the day. For example, a convenient bolt of lightning kills the villain. Turning to comedy, the chapter explains its history, beginning with comedy in Greek classical theater. After 3 tragic plays in a row, audiences were sent home in a happier mood thanks to a comic afterpiece, a 4th play, that typically poked fun at greed and corruption of Athenian society. Classical Greek comedy employed satire, a type of comedy that ridicules corruption, inequality, injustice, etc. The classic Greek satire Lysistrata by Aristophanes remains popular today with its anti-war message and its spotlight on the amusing frailties of human nature. Shakespeare's comedies emphasize comic characters. One such character is Sir John Falstaff, a drunk, liar, and con man with whom audiences can identify because of his all-too-human weaknesses. Farce is a genre of comedy involving outrageous physicality and chaotic, unbelievable situations. The characters are stock characters or comic types, such as the scheming servant or a vain old man. A type of contemporary comedy of the 20th century is the anti-middle-class comedy, exemplified by the plays of Kaufman and Hart in You Can't Take It With You and the familiar Odd Couple by Neil Simon. The technique of parody makes fun of particular works, like, say, a movie or a song, that the parodist feels are undeservedly popular. Give some thought to the discussion points. We'll address them in class. Because of its connection to satire, this chapter moves next to a discussion of the theater of the ideas. This form of verisimilitude was used to raise the consciousness of the audience by 2 dramatists of the late Victorian period, Ibsen and Shaw. Also, in the latter half of the 19th century, contemporaries of Ibsen and Shaw were experimenting with naturalism, a theater genre that attempted to show life as it really was without trying to affect change in society. Chekhov was a pioneer of naturalistic theater. He focused on the tensions within families that influenced many subsequent dramatists, most notably Tennessee Williams with his Glass Menagerie, and Eugene O'Neill and his play Long Day's Journey into Night. During the 20th century, theater began to reflect a new reality. The modern theater of ideas spoke to the disillusioned theater-goer of the post-World War I era. Bertolt Brecht offered the theater of alienation, in which he deliberately tried to distance his audience from the action with music hall antics so that they could focus on his message. The History Boys, a much more recent play by Alan Bennett, also conveys an ideological message, but does not attempt to alienate the audience in so doing. Unlike Brecht's, Bennett's characters feel real to us, and we identify with them while still taking into account the social issues being critiqued by their author. The theater of cruelty, so called because it presents shocking, violent scenes in order to jolt the audience's emotions, continues to attract audiences. A contemporary play exemplifies this technique in Martin McDonagh's A Behanding in Spokane from 2010. Again, give some thought to the discussion points in preparation for this week's class. And I know there are a lot of terms here. During the narration, in the last 10 minutes or so, I referred to almost all of the key terms listed here. So make sure you familiarize yourself with them and practice with the key terms quiz. Again, thanks for listening.